Okay, we can go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Effective Refugee Storytelling and Messaging Workshop. This workshop is a part of the Refugee Leadership Development Program with We're All America, an Opportunity for All. And as part of the training today, we'll have members from Refugee Congress and Refugee Advocacy Lab facilitating. We can go ahead to the next slide. I will go ahead and just give a bit background on the organizations. In the meantime, please feel free to share your name, your state, if there's an affiliation, and country of origin in the chat. So Opportunity for All is a national leadership table that oversees and ensures the success of We're All America core pillars. It's led by diverse refugees and immigrants. OFE is designed to ensure representation and inclusivity of those with lived experiences, to shift narrative of refugees and immigrants to one that reflects their contribution and lived experiences. Next slide, please. The Refugee Advocacy Lab aims to grow the diverse constituency of the US leadership on refugee protection, both at home and around the world. The Refugee Advocacy Lab supports the refugee advocacy community by developing and sharing strategic communication, insight, supporting inclusive policies, and developing partnerships as well. Next slide, please. The Refugee Congress is a national nonpartisan organization. It's built and led by former refugees, asylum seekers, and other vulnerable migrants to promote the well-being and dignity for all vulnerable migrants. Next slide. And I'll pass it over to our speakers to introduce themselves. Throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and type your questions and send it to the chat. And at the end, we'll have a question and answer section. So I'll pass it over to Ida to introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Ida Jugai, and I'm the elected delegate representing Massachusetts for Refugee Congress. I'm super excited to be here with all of you. I see some fellow refugees and asylees in the chat, folks from across the country. So it's super exciting to have you join us today. I'll pass it over to Dagmar Wheat.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dagmar Cabeda. I'm the Refugee Congress Communications and Advocacy Associate, as well as the outreach assistant for the Refugee Advocacy Lab. I was born and raised in Ethiopia, and I resettled in the United States in 2010 and as a derivative asylee. And I'm really excited to be here with you all to share a little bit about effective refugee storytelling. And I'll pass it over to Tshiku.
Thanks, guys. My name is Tshiku Henry. I'm originally from Congo, and I'm currently a delegate for the Refugee Congress in the state of Washington. I'm also working with Jewish Family Service. I love to work with refugees and immigrants. So thank you for having you guys. So I will pass it back again to the moment.
Ida, if you want to go ahead and get us started.
Sure, definitely. So it's cool to see an amazing combination of people that are here, both people with lived experience of being a refugee, asylee, or a displaced person, or folks who are working in the humanitarian space. This conversation will be great for all folks who are a part of that group. One of the things we wanted to talk about today is how to decentralize the power of our narrative. And I'll speak in terms of just in terms of refugees and immigrants and others who are displaced. Oftentimes, and we can go to the next slide, oftentimes one of the things that happens is that we, as in an effort to really humanize refugees, we choose story frames that don't necessarily empower refugees. So our goal is to really figure out, how do we disrupt those mainstream humanitarian narratives? They're usually either the universal victim, meaning somebody who is suffering, who is a suffering victim and a passive recipient. There's often a lot of pity associated with that kind of narrative. And then there's also the super refugee, that perfect refugee who does everything. They are an Olympic swimmer. They are the amazing entrepreneur. They are the genius. So there's like those two combating narratives on polar opposites. The tricky part about that is that it really impacts the way refugees, immigrants, and other displaced people talk about their stories. For speaking through kind of the asylum process, one of the first things that you need to prove in order to get asylum is that you're a victim. And so from immediately, you start to think through that lens. Thinking through the lens of victim, it often robs us of our worthiness. And so those are one of the themes that we want to talk about later as well. One of the suggestions that we love to make, if we look at the next slide just for a moment, is who has that narrative authority and what can we do about it? So anytime that you're thinking about whether you're the one telling the story of your own experience or telling the story of the experience of other people, who has that narrative and what can you do about it? So oftentimes we can generalize those narratives of displacement. So refugees, immigrants, and other people who are displaced have very unique stories. Generalizing is often one of the first mistakes that we'll make. And then the second piece is there's a deep and unequal power imbalance between that displaced person and the storyteller, as well as the audience. So there's often a need to put refugee, immigrant, and other displaced stories into a certain box that would appeal either to the storyteller, to people who are hearing the story, like the audience, or the person who's helping write that story. One of the things that we can think about, in addition to telling refugee stories, for example, I'm a part of the Refugee Storytellers Collective, and it's a part of the Refugee Advocacy Lab in partnership with Refugee Congress. So we're all about telling stories. It's incredibly important to humanize refugees. So we're not saying that's a bad thing. But I think one of the things that's really important is to not only think about the person, because when you think about the person, it puts the focus on that individual and the worthiness of that individual. One of the things that we can do is actually talk about the context of displacement. So, for example, if we open up the two links that we have there, Andres, that would be awesome. These are interesting examples of an article, but the picture there is really specific. As you can see, there is no face of a person that people can determine, are they worthy or not? Are they worthy to be a part of our society or not? It's more of people are able to see the context within which that person comes from. And then the second article also shows a similar photo, which is showing the context from which people are coming from. This also gives us the opportunity not to also figure out whether refugees are worthy or not, but also to show the context and how are refugees and people who are working in the humanitarian space helping to aid situations like these. And so if we can try to use that lens in narratives, that could be make a really huge impact. And then we can absolutely go to the next slide, which Goodwin is going to kind of take that a little bit further and talk about what are some of the research that has been done to help us contextualize how the audience would be more receptive to the stories of refugees and immigrants and what that audience looks like. Goodwin?
Yeah, thank you, Ida. So we can go to the next slide. I'll be sharing a little bit with you all on effective messaging when we decide to share our stories in a field and within this field and findings from the Refugee Advocacy Lab and the Goodwin Simon Strategic Research Approach. And this will really focus on how using the theory of change, we can really help humans change their behaviors by tapping into different aspects of our human experiences. We can go to the next slide. So in order to bridge that gap in the need for research around ways people want to effectively message on refugee issues, the Refugee Advocacy Lab and the Goodwin Simon research really set out to do some research around it. And as you can see on the slide, despite some polarization, polling actually indicates that there's a baseline of support across political spectrum that can be mobilized to action. If you look at the graph, you can see from very liberal to very conservative individuals who have voted within this research that America has a responsibility to accept refugees. So there's that baseline of support that we can all use to mobilize into action as we're sharing our stories. You can go ahead to the next slide. So the research found that, overall people want to be compassionate, they want to be welcoming, and they want to be their best selves. And people express just a genuine compassion, empathy for people who are refugees and asylum seekers. So it's really important to be able to really understand your audience and see what type of narrative that you want to choose as you're speaking to different audiences. And so we use this approach called the heart-wired approach in order to help us identify how we want to communicate with our different audiences. The heart-wired approach really speaks into tapping to humans' emotions, which are the feelings that we have in response to the world, our identities, our lived experiences, our values, and our beliefs. And so for our messaging to really be effective and heard, when we make those connections to those human-based values, it will really help our audience be able to understand and hear our stories, and also, mobilize them into action, because we're tapping into commonality between one another. You can go ahead to the next slide. So as we're speaking to different audiences, it's really important to see, as we're looking at our different audiences, our narratives, there's key messaging and key effective messaging that this research have found and recommends as we're sharing our stories. The first is disrupting fixed and flawed mental templates. And one of the key insights from this research is that often our audience has kind of a flawed and incomplete understanding of, not only the refugee resettlement process, but overall the US immigration system. And so there's this assumption and lack of knowledge that often leads individuals to question or have kind of assumptions about this process. And it's really important to be able to meet our audience where they are. And so in order to kind of break down those mental templates or those assumptions, it's really critical that we're lifting up a wide range of messages, not only sharing the stories of, our trauma stories that's often asked for us for refugees and asylees and immigrants to share, but also highlighting different aspects of our lives, whether that be sharing your personal stories or highlighting the process, how we resettle in the United States and our contributions that we make to the community, and just giving kind of a bigger idea to kind of help break down those assumptions or those fixed, flawed mental templates that our audience might have. You can go to the next slide. Oh, sorry, go ahead. I apologize. Go back to the previous slide. I forgot that I had everything listed on here, but another key finding is that many different messages make a difference. So as I mentioned earlier, when we try to paint a bigger picture of our experiences, it really helps our audience understand our experiences. So we found that when refugees share, parts of their story, such as like what the screening process looks like, and what personal experiences coming to the United States as they arrive and as they're reunited with families look like, highlighting that, as refugees and immigrants come here, they might need short-term help, but eventually, they are able to become independent and contribute to their communities. Highlighting details about integrating into our community, like being part of faith community or starting jobs or being a neighbor or just being a community member. Those really help allow us to message to different audience and tap into those hardwired values that I mentioned earlier. And then another key finding is filling in the knowledge gap. So as we're taking away kind of these assumptions by providing people different aspects of our lives, that leaves a knowledge gap. So, and in order to kind of make sure those knowledge gaps are not filled with additional assumption, it's really important to fill in those gaps with our stories and our experiences. So an example of this can be, someone might have an assumption that when someone is resettled in the United States, that they are dependent for the rest of their time here. And so in order to take away that assumption when we're sharing our stories of our experiences of how we're contributing into our society, or how we are, just as neighbors, as community members, how we are existing within our community, that will really help not only take away the assumption, but fill in that gap with other facts for them to really understand the full breadth of somebody's personal life and human life, and kind of humanize the process of being a refugee, asylee, or an immigrant. Another key finding is making it local is really critical and effective when we share our stories. And this is because I think people often think that, the issues that refugees and asylum seekers and immigrants are facing are really distant or far away from them. And so a lot of our community members or a lot of leaders might not know that they know someone that's a refugee or an asylee, or someone that is within their community have faced those experiences. And so when we're making it local and really highlighting the local aspects of our lives, it really helps understand and share with our audiences that this is an issue that's close to them, and will really mobilize them to be able to make that difference and change. And then another key finding is that, language considerations are really important as we're sharing our stories. So instead of using phrases like refugee or an immigrant, using phrases as someone who is an immigrant or a person that is seeking refuge, or using phrases, instead of using phrases like refugee resettlement, using phrases that are more value-based, like safety of people fleeing prosecution or welcoming refugees. This will really help paint an image of a person's full life and humanize that process. And a lot of times when we share language like refugee resettlement to a lot of people who may not be from this field, or who may be an audience from a different aspect, or who can be from a very conservative aspect of area, it could be really hard for them to kind of grasp what refugee resettlement means. It feels like a bigger system, or something that they might not be able to wrap their heads around or understand fully what that context looks like. So when we're putting it more in a humanized and value-based process of safety for people fleeing prosecution or welcoming refugees, it taps back into the idea that everyone, and with it from this research finding, that everyone wants to be good and everyone wants to have a desire to really welcome and have a country that is inclusive, and it will allow people to kind of fully understand that process a little bit more. And that is it on my end. I'll pass it over to Tashiku.
All right, so as you can see from the previous speaker, can you go to the next slide? As you can see from previous speaker, we have all talked about one particular thing is story, sharing of our stories as refugee, because that's remain a stamp on our lives. The story that we went through as refugees will remain forever in our heart, in our blood, and even our grandchildren will one day say, my grandparents were once a refugee. So telling a story, first of all, is a tool for healing and advocacy. So we have to take opportunity and advantage of this, the power of the storytelling. So, and the power of storytelling become effective when it is effectively and positively answers to the audience expectation. As a storyteller, understanding of human emotions, motivations, and psychology is a key to a successful and effective storytelling. Because when you understand the audience that you are talking to, you will know which message that you are going to talk to them. What is their motivation? What is their emotion? And what is their expectation? Because by knowing those things will give you a framework and a good message for you to deliver, so that your message, your story, should have an impact. That will take me to my next slide, that I have to tell you, like, as a storyteller, you have to know exactly how to control your narrative so that it can respond to the need or to the challenge that you want to solve as a person. And that's why I try to make it in 4 W's. My first W that I try to put is what? You as a storyteller, as a person who wants to share your story with people, you have first to know what do you want to talk about? What is the impact that you're expecting to have after sharing your story? Identifying a topic or part of the story that you can share is very critical. And the second thing, you have to know when you should be able to talk your story. Is that the right moment for you to share your story? Are you ready? Are you really having all the knowledge, even to the audience that you are sharing your story? Because you have to know your audience for you to share your story. You can't just go with your story. Remember, your story is a weapon that you have for a change that you're expecting. The story for refugee is the weapon that we are using for advocacy. So you have to know to whom you are targeting your weapon. That is your story, okay? And where should you talk about this? What is the platform that you are using for you to share your story? For example, you want to advocate for something. That particular thing, sometimes you have to advocate it in private, but you go with your story in public. You see, there's something that you have to talk in private and something that you have to talk in public. There is something that you have to talk to one person. There is also something that you have to talk to a group of people. So you have to identify the right place for you to share your story so that it should have the impact that you're expecting. And to who, and that's my last W. Who are you talking to? Is it the right audience? You have to do research. You have to know like what I'm presenting. Let me give an example. Everybody in this country, in this platform, I believe you have some kind of spiritual beliefs that you believe in. And you also believe that there is also a negative side of that. For example, for those say there is God and there is also Satan. A lot of people believe Satan is bad and God is good. So when you want to ask for good things, do you go to ask for Satan? No, you go for God because you believe that that's the one having a good things. So when you want to request for a change, you have to go to the people that you expect that these people will bring change. You get me? So don't go to ask for change for the people that you don't expect that they will bring change. So let's go to see together this short video of our colleague Drocella, so that at the end, we're going to answer to few questions that together we're going to see what she wanted to talk and what impact do you think we can have. And from there, we can have an idea that next time when we are sharing our story, remember I say our story is a tool for change, is a tool to create impact, is a tool for advocacy, and also a tool for healing for ourselves, because when we share our story, it helps us to heal ourselves from the wound, struggle, and all the challenges that we went through. Okay, let's play this short video. It's about a minute or 2 minutes, something like that.
Have you ever felt that the whole world was falling on you? I felt that way in 2008 when I was forced to flee my native country, Rwanda, because of my political opinions. I lost my family, I lost the country, I lost my career, and everything I invested in for more than 40 years. I didn't see my children for 2 years, and I didn't talk to them for 1 year. I was mad, I was disoriented, I was dissatisfied, I was angry. But because of faith, I told myself, you have to be strong and hopeful, so one day you can be reunited with your family again. I was then connected to the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees, and after getting the refugee status, I felt still insecure. And then I was connected to the US Embassy for refugee resettlement. Even though I used to come to this country on a diplomatic passport, I had to go through the tough screening and long process like any other refugee. The day I heard that I was approved to come to America, I jumped. America, American government, thank you for giving me a second chance. Thank you for bringing my children here. Lawmakers, I ask you to vote for a substantial budget so the program can be restored locally and overseen, so families can be reunited. I also ask you to hold the government accountable for all the promises they are making. Those children I was talking about are now giving forward in different areas of industry and life: accounting, nursing, supply chain, traveling, in social and customer service. Not only that, I am an engaged community servant leader, and I'm touching different lives so my community can thrive. If we rock our arms together and sustain the program, it can be an economic model for low-income and marginalized families. Lawmakers, decision makers, community members, let us sustain the refugee program so America can remain the world leader in refugee program. Thank you.
Wow, that's just amazing. That's just amazing to hear that powerful story. That's a weapon, and I know even the one you're following, you feel how it touches your heart. You know, let's go to the next slide so that we can conclude on what Drocella wanted to say. Here we can see, first of all, she really thanks. You have to recognize the support. We, the people that we advocate for people, first of all, we have to recognize the support that this country is giving to the refugees, okay? And we have to advocate, and that's our main objective, is to advocate, you know? Hope is there, because when advocating, you have to have hope that one day what advocating is going to happen, you know? It also helps us to heal from the wound that we went through. And remember in the story, the video that Drocella shared, she was articulating point after point, the pains she went through, the process that she took to come to the United States of America, and also directing what was her request. And she pointed out directly to the intended people that she wanted her message to be received. She pointed out directly to the lawmaker, to the authority, that we want this to happen. We want this to happen. So we as people advocating for refugees, we storytellers, we have to make sure that whenever we are sharing our stories, we have our main topic should be, will that create an impact? And what will that impact be? Thank you very much. So I will turn it back to the next speaker so that we can come up with good things again.
That was awesome, Chichiku. Thank you so much. It was so, every time I hear Drocella's story, I'm inspired. So I'm reflecting on what you shared with us. One of the things that we want to dive into too is, how do you move from consequences to choices? Consequences meaning all of these different things happen to us as refugees. The choice is not always ours. It's not ours. And so things are always happening to us. How do we move from the space of things happening to us happening to things, to making choices, to advocate, to tell our story in the way we want it to be told? So we'll go to the next slide. I wonder, Chichiku, do you want to share with us the power of sharing a story, and I'll dive into an example?
The power of sharing your story, first of all, is really help you to release from the burden that you have. You know, it's also the power that, as I said, it's a weapon. You know, when we talk about a power, we see something that can create a change, something that can influence. So our story, when we are telling it change, it gives a meaning to some people, because a lot of people don't know even that who is a refugee. Sometimes a lot of them just believe like, when we come here as refugees, we come here for food stamp, we come here to take jobs, but they don't forget that we're here to create jobs as well. So when we are sharing our stories with the public, you know, it has a lot of power. So it's very good to recognize that our story that we are sharing has a lot of impact, and we have to make sure that we manage the impact or the outcomes of the story that we are sharing.
One of the things that Chichiku mentioned too is how sharing our story has a power to heal. And it absolutely does. When I think about worthiness, it's probably one of the main things that's been always at the top of my mind. I spent probably the majority of my life after I came to the United States hiding my entire background as much as I could from people, because the majority felt that I wasn't worthy enough to participate in the American society. And I think one of the things that we really have to think about is who is worthy, and do we have the right to decide what that looks like for people? And also, how do we find that worthiness after being told that we're not worthy by people and others, by stories that we read, by our governments, by our neighborhoods, by our communities? And so sometimes that could be by being surrounded by people who believe in you and love you, and your community that is a source of support. And it can also come from within, finding that worthiness. I didn't feel worthy until I got my US citizenship, which was just a couple of years ago. I didn't feel worthy to speak up. I didn't feel worthy to be a part of American society in the way that people wanted me to. I also got messages of unworthiness throughout. So I tried to err towards the side of a super refugee as much as I could. But that is not healing, and that is not something that we should subject people to constantly having to prove that they're worthy of being here, and that they're participating in the American story is reflected on others. Refugees are people. They have the right to heal. They don't have to be a tool for the economy. They're humans. And so that's one of the things that we should really think about when we think about worthiness is, are we sharing stories that make our story a story of worthiness, or is it a story that we want to share as a tool of change? Well, I'd love to see if there is a volunteer in the audience who might want to participate in the next exercise, where we'll talk about how we're examining things in our experience and how that can fuel our advocacy. And this is the way that we can change that. And I see your question there, Dave. And that's, there's very, very many ways in which we can take a look at what we're experiencing and advocate on behalf of those things changing. My story of worthiness is not unique, and is very common among the refugee, immigrant, and displaced people's experience. So there's absolutely things that we can do, and the US citizenship doesn't necessarily have to be a stamp to tell you that you can do it. Please don't wait and don't make the same mistake that I did. So I wonder if anybody would be willing to participate in sharing a unique problem that they've identified that's connected to their story. And if you are, raise your hand. I'll give you a few seconds to, about 30 seconds for folks. I know it's a big thing to join in a group, but it would be awesome if you're able to join me on this little journey. Thank you for sharing her story, Dave. I see it in the chat. Totally, you don't want to put anybody on the spotlight. So if folks don't want to raise their hand, it's totally understandable. Okay, we'll go forward. One of the key things that we can do in the beginning is, and we can go to the, yes, the chat is awesome. Thank you, Andres. We can go to the next slide. So identify a problem. So when you think about a problem that you've experienced in your daily life that you want to change, we can use Drocella's story as an example, so you can think of that as one, and I'll share one as well with you. The one example is my father and I, before, at the time when I came, my sister and I came here first, so my father came a year later. And my parents came a year later after my sister and I, but we didn't have any money with us. We literally just had change. And we went to a grocery store and we tried to pay with our change, and they told us we just got milk and bread. The lady just looked at us with such disgust and said, "I'm not counting this." and it was the only money we had. We couldn't buy milk and bread. So here's the problem. We have money. Why are they not taking our money? So that's one example. If you go to the next slide, paint the picture. So share the story and how you personally experienced this problem. How does it relate to who you are? So I briefly shared the story with you. We were waiting in line. The lady looked at us with a disgusting face. She didn't allow us to pay for our food, and we left the store without paying for food. How does it relate to who I am or who we are? We didn't speak English at the time, so we couldn't figure out what we needed to do. It was absolutely impossible for us to advocate on behalf of ourselves, us. Why would they listen to us? We have no idea whether this is an okay thing or not, given that we come from a country that did just that. So that's how you can paint a picture, telling the story of that experience. And then the next slide after that is kind of introducing a new way of thinking. What do you think could be some ways to address that problem? Can people really find solutions? So, and are there any other people that can help you find those solutions? So immediately my thought is, why would people be allowed to not pay for food with money, even though it's change as opposed to $1 bills or anything like that? Is that a rule or not? So I actually went to different people that I knew that worked at a grocery store to better understand, is this the case? Can people actually prevent you from doing that? And I realized that actually they can't prevent you from paying with change. If there are rules when people are trained that you can or can't get paid with change. So I actually connected with a whole group of folks that worked at the grocery store to see if we can change these rules where people are able to pay with just spare change that they have instead of having to use bills. So the next slide is solving the problem. Is there anything you can do today to try to solve the problem you're experiencing? So the first thing that I did is I connected with people who I knew that worked at the grocery store that I shared with you all earlier. And I asked them, would they be willing to talk to the manager of that store to make sure that there's a rule that everybody should be allowed to pay with real money, whether that is coins or cash. So we ended up doing that and proposing that solution to the manager of the store. That's one way in which you can solve the problem for that one store. That also applies to what Chichiko shared earlier, finding the who and what you want to share and how that impacts you. And the next slide. And then the call to action is what do you want to ask of others? Who else can join you in tackling this problem? After this one store said that they would want to do that and they want to make it a policy that you can pay with anything, whether it be cash or a coin, what would be the call to action? So what we ended up doing is we actually reached out to all of the local stores and we ended up actually creating policies to prevent that from ever happening again to people who don't have bills, who only have just enough to pay for the food that they have. That's just one small example of how you can use your personal experience. So you would identify a problem that you're experiencing, painting the picture for people of how it relates to your story and your experience, introduce a new way of thinking for people that this is not okay, it doesn't have to be this way. And then really try to solve the problem already on your own and engage others who might know more about that problem to help solve with you. And then inspire people into action because you don't have to do it on your own. And then by the end of that process, you've become an advocate. This is a story from a very long ago for me, but I think it's a really good example of how we can leverage our story for advocacy. I think that's the end of the slides. Is that true, Andres? Now we have Dagmar sharing with us some of the tools and resources that we'll end up sharing with you afterwards. But in the meantime, we'd love to see if you have any questions, if you want to raise your hand or drop it in the chat.
And if folks are not comfortable unmuting and asking questions, please feel free to drop it in the chat as well.
Hi, so we have one of the questions here. I noticed an anonymous attendee. Could you please explain again what the Refugee Advocacy Lab does, and in particular, tell us more about the group of storytellers that works there?
And Dagmary, do you want to take this one?
Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself, but yes, so the Refugee Advocacy Lab, as I mentioned, it just aims to grow a diverse constituency of the U.S. Leadership on refugee protection here and abroad. So it really does a lot of work around strategic communication, provides inclusive policies for refugee protection as well. And then also part of it as the strategic communication is leading the Refugee Storytellers Collective. And the collective is really individuals who are experts in different fields who want to come together and share stories for change. And through the Refugee Storytellers Collective, we offer several different trainings that really focus on allowing people to have the resources they need to be able to fully share their stories in the way that they want to. So we have trainings focused around journalism. We have focused trainings around, sharing your story and public speaking with anxiety, and just different aspects that really help people who want to be able to speak and share their stories and provide those resources to them. And if there are no additional questions, I can go into like additional resources that everyone can tune into in terms of wanting to share their stories and also understand different ways that they can get started in being able to share their stories. So as I mentioned, the Refugee Storytellers Collective is one of the resources. We also have Weave Tales, the New American Speakers Program, that also provides trainings for newcomers. And in order to help them be able to share their stories, there's Stories Without Borders, StoryCorps, also We Are All America. These are all resources that will really help everyone not only get trainings around storytelling, but also advocacy and really equip leaders who want to share their stories. And then if for anybody who might have questions around the Refugee Advocacy Lab or the GSSR Stratcoms training that I shared, please feel free to email me. My emails are on the slide, but we'll also drop it in the chat, and I will be able to connect with you further on that. And I know that we'll be able to share we'll be able to share the recording and the slide afterwards for those. So you'll have access to all the links and email addresses for if you want to connect with any of the facilitators. Okay, we can go ahead to the next slide. So in addition to the resources I shared earlier, as I mentioned, this workshop is part of the Refugee Leadership Development Program with We're All America and Opportunity for All. So the first is the effective refugee storytelling and messaging that you all attended, but there's several other trainings that we'll be able to provide. The next one will be on March 17, Basic US Government 101 and 102, but there's also other trainings like Power Mapping, Politics of Oppression and Legislative Process, Organizing Your World, Your Own World Refugee Day event, and several other trainings that you all can sign up for and participate. And we really encourage you all to sign up for those. And I believe Andres has dropped the link in the chat. And we'll also invite you all to join us for the launch of the Opportunity for All table, which will be happening on February 23rd. And so that also information will be dropped in the chat. And like I mentioned earlier, we'll be able to send a recording and the slides to everyone, so you all have the links for everything.
And I'm gonna just paste that in here in case. But thank you everybody for joining us tonight. We hope that this was helpful, and we'll go ahead and follow up with all of the attendees with the resources we've shared today and the recording. We appreciate you all, and feel free to connect with us and all of the resources and folks that we've shared, and we hope you'll join us in the future trainings as well. Bye everybody.